Okay, so today we're continuing with our What's Wrong with Our Trees series. Today we're going to talk about some of the symptoms that might be associated with certain commonly occurring diseases of trees in Alberta. And again, joining me is Mr. Toso Bozic, arborist extraordinaire, or owner of Yard Whispers in Edmonton, and CEO of ATTS Group. Welcome again, Toso.
Thank you, Robert. Nice to see
Okay,
you again.
yeah, thanks. Okay, so today we're going to talk about tree diseases. This is some of my favorite stuff. I love diseases. I mean, not in a I don't like to see them, but I like that when I can recognize what they are. So if you had to pick from the big list of possible diseases that affect our trees, what would you say some of the most common diseases that you might see in our broadleaf or deciduous trees would be? What would you say our top ones are?
The two most common in the broadleaf would be a black knot and the fireblight. That's
Okay.
affected so relatively speaking broad range of the hardwood species.
Yep.
And then we do have on the coniferous side, we have a Rhizosphaera Needlecast and Cytospora Canker, which is also very common
Yeah. Right.
throughout Alberta.
Okay. Well, let's talk about each of them and what people just basically what sign or symptoms people might expect to, how do they recognize that they might have one of these particular diseases? Let's talk black knot. This is a super common disease in Alberta.
Yeah.
What would they be looking for?
With the black knot, it's relatively easy to recognize. They have if you, number one, we have to go back and realize that black knot is affecting certain group of the tree species, and we call them genus of the Prunus. And there is a Mayday choke cherries and several others that is
Yeah,
affected by the black
the
knot.
cherry type trees,
The
all the ones
cherry
that
type,
cherries. Yeah.
all of cherries that they have. And lots of people, the best way to recognize they have the why it's called black knot, they have like a black swelling that is on the branch, generally speaking, and it's relatively easy to recognize that. And it can, they can be in the small side, but they can be also very large. That sometimes it's can go from 1 inch to 5, 6, 7 inch in some really extreme cases.
Yep.
They're really black and dark, and they are, or many times you can see the branch hanging, and there is a black swelling around them. That people can relatively easy to recognize that symptoms.
Yep. Now that one's it's funny though, people don't notice it until you point it out, and then all of a sudden they see it everywhere, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And even us, I mean, I noticed, yesterday I was out and I was looking for something else, and what do you know, a black knot in that tree, and I hadn't even noticed that tree or that black knot before. It's just hides in there, right?
Well, again, that's one of the things I want to emphasize to your clients is that black knot is the best way to recognize actually during the winter times.
Absolutely.
You can really see it when it's during the growing season, when the leaves are out. Actually, it's not easy. You really have to come up close and look at inside of the crown and the leaves and recognize, oh, this is a black knot. So the winter time is the best.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing. What you can do is probably in the winter time, when you only thing you can do is do the pruning and do the proper pruning as the winter time, that you are able to see where exactly the black knot is, and then you do the proper pruning and removal. You don't ever remove the black knot during the growing season unless you really have to. In many ways.
Yeah, in dire circumstances. What about Fireblight? Let's talk Fireblight. What are we looking for there? What's the signs of that or symptoms of that?
Fireblight is there is a reason why it's called Fireblight. It's you might have again, it's a certain group of this, trees and shrubs species that is acceptable to the Fireblight. Many of them again in the orchards, and the biggest thing with the Fireblight, you have like a burned leaves. So during the growing season, you see the trees or shrubs perfectly fine and green, and everything goes well, and suddenly you go literally wake up next morning and suddenly see that half of the branch or whole trees suddenly just brown, and it's looked like somebody took a tiger torch and burned the trees, and that's why it's called Fireblight. There's a reason for that. So that is very relatively easy to detect. So you can see that one branch used to be green, and you notice that in the trees, and suddenly its whole branch or half of the tree or tree is just brown, and then the color is depending on, it's usually brownish, light brown, that you can see, and it's many times it's like a hanging. It's, as I said, it's the best example is that somebody came with a tiger torch and just
scorched it,
smack off,
burned it off,
burn it off in many ways. So it's the Fireblight, actually, matter of fact, is the bacteria. It's not even a fungus whatsoever. And same as in the case in the black knot, the only way is once you detect that is the removal. And once you do the removal, then you have to dispose both cases. And disposal is very important. Lots of people cut, but they leave either black knot or Fireblight. They leave on the spot, and then actually spreading more diseases. So both in both situations, the best way is you prune it. You do the proper pruning, which is really requires a little bit knowledge about pruning. Especially with those two problems, and then you take the black bag and dispose them and send them to the garbage and send to the landfill. If you have to remove the whole tree to save all the rest of the trees, you have to remove the whole tree, but don't leave the diseased trees in your yard or your backyard or whatever you have.
Get rid of it. Okay, let's switch over to the conifers then. So talk to me about Rhizosphaera Needlecast. What are we looking for there?
It's a very common, as I said, most of the time, the diseases, they like where it's a lots of humidity and the heat. Usually most of the diseases is developed between 22 and 26 degrees, and that's where they spread. And they spread either by the wind or by the droplets of the, when doing the rain season. With Rhizosphaera Needlecast, usually attack the needles that are 3, 4, 5 years old. And when you look in the trees, you're going to see the new growth of that year or last year growth, and green and healthy. But from there, you're going to notice the start really browning and going inwards toward to the trunk. And it's can usually go on the south side and southeast side, generally speaking, but which most of the problems with the trees is happening. But it can go all over the trees, and it can go from lower branch to the higher branch, and there's this distribution. This needlecast, generally speaking, is, I call them cosmetic disease. It's kind of especially a spruce tree, they lose the needles and you can see through the trees, and trees looks like much more bare than compared to the compacted and green all over. And not much you can do about that. There is several chemicals, and I want to warn all of your clients that chemicals is the last resource to use it. Number one, you have to be certified to use certain chemicals. Number two, many people really don't know when is the timing to use of that chemicals, and there's a very few people in Alberta really who be able to use the chemicals in many of those diseases. So I always said to use the chemicals as our last resource to control of this.
And there are limited options anyways, so you really don't have a lot of options anyways. So better to focus on TLC and the other parts that we can do. So. Okay, what about Cytospora canker? What are we looking at there?
That is compared to Rhizosphaera, that one is a little bit more more danger than the Rhizosphaera, because it's definitely can kill whole branch, eventually can kill whole tree. So that one, as I said previously, the Rhizosphaera, you have a new growth or last year growth green, and they will never attack those two. With the Cytospora, they will attack everything. New growth, last year growth, or 2 or 3 years growth, and they can take entire branches out.
Okay.
And you can notice in the tree when Cytospora hit is that 1 or 2 branch, the whole branch is out, even though last year that branch was totally fine. And the only way you can do with the Cytospora is really pruning and removal of that branch. And is the way of the controlling the Cytospora canker. It's definitely more damaging to trees, and usually if you have a Cytospora in your shelter belts or your yards, they can persist for years and eventually can really kill the tree.
And
compared to the
any other symptoms that might, like, I mean, so you get a whole branch turning brown and dying off. Anything else that might give you a clue?
There is, if you use the to enlarge, needles, and look at very closely needles for both Rhizosphaera, etc. In Rhizosphaera, you're gonna have like a black little dots on the needles that you can recognize, and in the Cytospora, you're gonna have a much more like a band, little red band around the needles that you can see into that. The other way for both of those disease is, we are in Alberta very fortunate. If you live in rural Alberta, you can send to the lab, and the people would be able to really in the lab detect which kind of disease you might have.
Does Cytospora have like a resin or anything? Does it make the branches like on the dead branches at all, or is that uncommon?
It is uncommon, and again, lots of people, you're going to see it on the dead branch is actually lichens.
Okay.
It's like people always kind of get scared, and they don't realize it's a lichen, and it has nothing to do with with the disease in that sense. And again, you might take a cut off some of the branch and to see if it's have a different in colors. But generally speaking, for general public, it's very hard. And even for the professionals, it's very hard to figure out what it is. So the best way sometimes is to send a live branch, not a dead one, send a live branch to the provincial lab that we're able to probably define, make sure that what you have is both of them.
So, but I mean, ultimately, you're going to need some help in some of these ones. When we're getting into diseases and stuff, it can be a little more complex than your average Joe can handle.
Oh,
so.
It's definitely the diseases. And number one, it's much more harder to identify than any insects. Number two, most of the time you can't do a lot. The only tools that are available for the people is actually pruning. And if you have some of the other diseases like Armillera root rot, you might be able to change the species. And that's when I come to this message to you, Robert, that if you plant the trees, I always I said to everybody that diversify, diversify, diversify. What it means, if you have in your yard or the shelter belts, don't just plant one species, one spruce and pine, and that's it. No, plant as many as possible different species, conifers, hardwoods, flowering, not flowering, and having those diversity of the trees and shrubs is actually, it's balance out the problem with diseases and insects, which is very important. So if you want to plant the trees in yard and you have 5 of them, don't plant all 5 of them same. Take 2 coniferous and 3 hardwoods, and they're totally not even the same we call genus. And so therefore diversify, 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 because one of the most common mistake, if you got some of those disease, let's say in shelter belt, when you have a row of the spruce, all of the spruce is going to get it.
Yeah. It's going to go from one to the next to the next.
And that makes and that's the challenge. So I want to make clear to everybody, regardless if you have insects or diseases or environmental issues, the more diverse tree and shrub species you have, the more healthier yard and your shelter belt you're going to have. Period.
Okay.
Because many times in certain situations, what is the beneficial insects on one tree species is going to controlling the bad insects and diseases and other tree species, and it's always balance out. Mother Nature find a way to balance out.
I agree. Yeah, good points. Okay, well, thanks, Toso. Those are good.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you, Robert.